For decades, Israel and the United States have been pushing to effect what's called regime change in Iran, to overthrow the current government of Iran and replace it with one that is docile and sympathetic to the Zionist project in the Middle East and US interests in the region, or to smash up the country into little bits, as took place in Syria. The current standoff is getting quite close to military attack. In this episode of Small World Geopolitics, I'll have a look at some of the history to how we've got to this point and what are the forces at play currently and what's likely to take place. So the story of the latest attacks on Iran really started in June last year, when the US manipulated or tricked Iran into thinking that they were having meaningful negotiations in order to provide cover for Israel to move in with a strike that came from inside, from units they'd planted inside Iran to take out a lot of key people in the Iranian military and political system. What that provoked was not what they had hoped, which was that there would be regime change. They kind of believed that Iran was a pack of cards, and with just a bit of a push, the people would rise up and overthrow the government, and their wishes would be fulfilled, the Israeli and American wishes. What actually happened was a big setback for them, because when Iran responded with some really high-powered, well-directed missiles that pounded Israel, before long, Israel and the US, or via the US, had to call for a ceasefire. Now, in the Western media, Trump says, that this was Iran that wanted the ceasefire, but it wasn't. It was definitely Israel that needed the ceasefire, because their air defenses weren't working. This ultimately became known as the 12-day war. But it's kind of a misnomer, because the war never ended. There was a ceasefire, not an end to the war, not an agreement, because Israel and the US don't want an agreement with Iran. They talk about negotiations. They don't want negotiations. They want to destroy Iran. That's been the objective for decades. So since June, they had a regrouping. And around about Christmas time, just in December, they started a new attempt. It began with a destabilization of the Iranian currency. Scott Bessent, who's now the US Treasury Secretary, who in an earlier life was a hedge fund manager, one of the people who was involved with George Soros in shorting and therefore kind of destroying the British pound, and trying the same technique in Asia in the late 90s. So he knows how to crash currencies, and he crashed the Iranian currency, and he kind of boasted about it in Davos recently. So the economy was crashed from external reasons, as well as, of course, the ongoing economic sanctions that hit Iran really hard. There were protests, and then ready for the protests were thousands and thousands of people who the Israelis and Americans had organized to be in there, Mossad agents, people from neighboring countries, Kurdish groups, various other groups that were armed, and their idea was to try to turn this legitimate demonstration about the rapid plunging in living standards into an all-out shooting war, to escalate it, to cause lots of violence, which would then create the sort of instability that could be capped off by American air raids and possibly Israeli air raids, which would lead to regime collapse and change in Iran. And at the beginning, it was pretty bad. They had people in all different places all over Iran, which is a huge area, the size of Western Europe, simultaneously organising armed riots and killings and burnings and stabbings and shootings. And, you know, there were accounts of these snipers sitting on roofs, shooting people on both sides, the protesters and the police, nobody knowing where shots were coming from. There was huge loss of life. Not as huge, of course, as what the Western media are saying. They're saying 30,000 people killed. Some are even saying 70,000 people killed, just ridiculous numbers. Just in the last little while, Iran has released official figures with names of people, the names of the people killed, and it looks like the total death toll is about 3,000, which is a lot of people. But they weren't all innocent bystanders and innocent protesters. It was a cauldron of violence and killing that was eventually brought to an end because the Iranians found a way to kind of destroy the lifeblood of this insurrection, which were tens of thousands of satellite communication things through Starlink that had been smuggled into the country. So the rioters were using these to coordinate amongst themselves. Iran found a way to kill those communications, and not only did they kill the communications, but they used the Starlink data to then track the units and to arrest many people who were using these things. The data from Starlink actually led them straight to the violent insurrectionists. So the whole situation, again, the hope was that with all of this violence and creating this furore in the Western media about this being, you know, innocent people who were getting slaughtered on the streets by this terrible regime, and they needed to be saved, and Trump going, don't worry, we'll come and save you. The plan was that they were going to again move in airstrikes and try to do regime change. But when the whole on-the-ground operation failed so badly, the airstrikes were called off. At the last minute, by some accounts, planes were actually in the air, ready to go. But part of the reason they were called off was that there was a recognition that the circumstances were no longer favourable to Israel and the US in Iran to try and topple the regime, and also the concern about what would happen, the sort of retaliation that Iran would engage in. So that was the second leg of this conflict. In the wake of that, Trump, all excited about, the regime's just about to collapse, moved his fleet of attack ships, aircraft carriers and so on, close to Iran, off the shore of Iran, and made threatening noises to Iran that if you don't adhere to our demands, then we will strike you and we will cause, I don't know what superlatives he used about the most enormous damage you've ever seen in your lives, or, you know, one of those kind of phrases, over the top phrases that Trump used about the destruction he was going to visit on Iran. Iran held firm, and Iran basically said very, very clearly, if you fire anything at us, we will fire all over the place at you, at the US, at all the US bases. So many US bases in that area, and they were all built with relatively weak air defense systems because they thought they're out of range of anything hostile. So all of those Gulf states that are in the Americans' pocket, that have got American bases, they would be hit. Israel would be hit. And they would be using these missiles that are incredibly powerful, incredibly accurate, as demonstrated in the original attack on Israel, a retaliatory attack on Israel, that Israel had no answer for. And so the usual policy of Iran of exercising restraint was off the table. They essentially said, one attack on us and we're just going to go for it. They're not going to wait to get blitzed before they retaliate. And it looked as though there was a lot of brinksmanship there, and quite a scary situation, because the US is now in a situation it's never been in before, where it's facing adversaries and trying to provoke conflict with adversaries, where before it could engage in these attacks in ways that didn't cause any casualties, and that was what Trump was wanting in Iran. That's what his instructions were to the military: find a way to do a quick in, a big boom, a media thing. Look how great and spectacular we are, a la Venezuela. That kind of show. That's what he wanted. He doesn't want boots on the ground. He doesn't want any casualties, and that was what he was aiming for. Some sort of hit like that on Iran. And what he's figured out eventually is that that option wasn't there. That if he did try to do something like that, the consequences would be enormous. And word's getting out now that it was actually Israel that was saying to him, "Don't do that. We're not ready for the retaliation." And so now he's in this situation where he's done his "I'm the big man" thing, and I'll threaten you, and if you don't do this, and da-di-da-di-da. And he's realized that he can't go through with his threats. So he needs to find a way to climb down. And he's quite good at doing this. There's been a few other things where he's done threatening and he's done all these things, and then he's climbed down and pretended that it was a victory. He did it with the Houthis in the Red Sea. He said that the Houthis desperately wanted a ceasefire. The US wanted the ceasefire. They were taking punishment and inflicting none. Well, not enough to stop the Ansar Allah continuing to attack them. The so-called 12-day war was another one. So where he pretended that was a US victory. So really he's kind of stuck, and he needs to find a way to manufacture a victory out of something that he can't really win in a big flashy sort of way. So the so-called solution to it was these talks that were supposed to be held first of all in Turkey, and then Iran didn't want to meet there, so they moved the talks to Oman, and representatives of the Iranian government and the US government through intermediaries in Oman had a brief exchange. The US tried to introduce things, all sorts of other things. It tried to issue orders to Iran about not selling oil to China. It tried to issue orders to Iran about abandoning its ballistic missile program, which is the only thing saving it from attack right now. And then there was the nuclear stuff. And Iran said, well, we'll talk to you about the nuclear stuff, but nothing else. And the ridiculous thing about the nuclear thing is that there is actually a solution to that problem. There was months and months ago, there was a suggestion that Iran was comfortable with, which was that all the states in the region, including Saudi Arabia and so on, they do sort of collective enrichment with supervision of not the IAEA, since they're clearly in Mossad's pocket, but agreed supervision things, so that it all happens collectively and out in the open. But the US and Israel don't want to compromise. They don't want a solution to this thing. So the negotiations from the American point of view are not to find a solution. They're to kind of catch breath and have a think about ways that they can find a way out of this bind. So, you know, Trump's kind of there. He's got all this thing. He wants to blow something up, but the Iranians have been very clear the consequences of blowing things up. The fleet's already been pushed further back from the coast. Apparently, it's about 1,000 miles or off the coast from where it was, because the Iranian drones are swarming around, and these ships are vulnerable to drones. They're big warships. If you get a swarm of a whole lot of drones and the air defences have to fire the lot at them, they will then effectively be undefended. So even the weapons of war that the US have assembled are not suitable for any kind of prolonged conflict. So Trump is desperate to find a quick move in, bash him, media opportunity, rah rah, aren't we great? And there doesn't seem to be one. So my feeling now is that, I think, as I did a video before, I think that if he did provoke this, anything could happen. And if some of that stuff was raining down on Israel, I wouldn't put it past Israel to respond with nuclear weapons. But I think what's more likely now is that the US needs to try and find a way to back out and in so doing pretend that that Iran has given in to some of its demands, and so as long as it keeps its promise to do that, then we won't attack it in the way that we could and we sort of should, but I'm so magnanimous that I'm such a big peacemaker that I'll make it all happen. So that's what I hope will happen, but in these things you never really quite know. But tensions will remain until something kind of gives in that area. This is Small World Geopolitics. It's a channel I've just started. If you like this content, please like and share and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.